My husband laughed in my father's face at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan, treating the man who gave me everything like an uneducated peasant. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, holding the check like a king, while my parents smiled politely. He had absolutely no idea that the modest regional logistics company he was mocking actually owned the private equity firm he was desperately begging for a bailout. And he definitely did not know that his quiet, supportive wife was the managing partner holding the executioner's pen. The ambient hum of Le Bernardin provided the perfect acoustic backdrop for my husband's arrogance. I sat perfectly still in my burgundy silk dress, watching Harrison swirl his wine. At 41, Harrison was the CEO of a commercial real estate development firm that he claimed was revolutionizing the eastern seaboard. I am 36, and for 7 years I have let him believe I just handle low-level portfolios for a mid-tier financial group. It kept the peace. To new beginnings, Harrison declared loudly, leaning across the pristine white tablecloth toward my parents. And Thomas, I insist on covering tonight. Please put your wallet away. Do not worry, this one dinner costs more than your little fleet of trucks makes in a month. My father, Thomas DuPont, exchanged a brief, serene glance with my mother, Catherine. They were old money, the kind of wealth that whispers instead of shouts. Their little fleet of trucks was actually a multi-billion-dollar blind trust. I was about to change the subject when my gaze drifted 2 tables over. Jessica, Harrison's 27-year-old vice president of acquisitions. She was pretending to read a menu, but her wrist caught the dim lighting. There, clamped securely on her arm, was the Cartier love bracelet I had supposedly lost during our trip to Aspen 3 months ago. Harrison snapped his fingers at the sommelier, a gesture that made my jaw tighten. "We will take the Chateau Margaux," he announced smoothly, dropping $3,000 on a single bottle of vintage Bordeaux to impress parents he fundamentally disrespected. He leaned back, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, completely blind to the storm gathering directly across the table. Beneath the linen tablecloth, my phone vibrated with a sharp double pulse. It was my secure encrypted channel. The sender was Marcus Pierce, my brother-in-law. Marcus is a 39-year-old African-American corporate litigator who married Harrison's sister 5 years ago. From the day we met, Marcus and I recognized each other as the only adults in a family of entitled children. He has been my quiet, fiercely loyal ally ever since. I unlocked the screen, keeping my face arranged in a pleasant mask. Marcus had sent 2 high-resolution scanned documents with a simple message that read, "Check the signature." I opened the first file. It was a quitclaim deed. The property listed was my ancestral Hamptons estate, the one my grandmother left entirely to me in a revocable living trust. I swiped to the second document. It was a commercial mezzanine loan application for $40 million, listing my personal investment portfolio and the Hamptons property as collateral. At the bottom of both pages was my signature, except I had never signed them. Harrison was not just sleeping with his vice president. He was actively committing federal wire fraud and forgery. His commercial real estate firm was not preparing for a triumphant Series B funding round. His company was drowning in insolvency, and he was secretly leveraging my bloodline and my life's work to save himself from bankruptcy. I looked up from my screen. Harrison was laughing at a joke he had just made, pouring the expensive Bordeaux into my mother's glass with the manufactured charm of a seasoned con artist. A lesser woman might have screamed. She might have thrown the $3,000 wine in his face or marched over to Jessica and ripped the Cartier gold right off her wrist. But 15 years of navigating the predatory waters of high finance had taught me a different approach. I possessed a deadly calm. I simply took a sip of my water, watching the man who was attempting to bankrupt my family dig his own grave. I set my glass down with deliberate precision. The crystal made a soft, resonant clink against the table, bringing Harrison's attention back to me. "Is everything all right, Victoria?" he asked, flashing that practiced, charismatic smile that had fooled me a decade ago. "Everything is perfectly fine," I replied, matching his smile with a warmth that did not reach my eyes. "I was just reflecting on how far you have come. Let us propose a toast." I lifted my wine glass, and the rest of the table followed. My parents raised theirs with polite grace, while Harrison beamed, practically puffing his chest out in pride. "To Harrison," I said, my voice smooth and level. To your unmatched brilliance and the incredible future of your company, may you receive exactly what you have earned. I appreciate that, darling, Harrison said, taking a generous swallow of his wine. He leaned in close, resting his hand over mine. His palm felt clammy. Actually, since we are celebrating, I should mention a minor administrative task. My legal team is finalizing the paperwork for the new funding round tomorrow morning. There is a routine spousal consent form they need you to sign. It is just a standard formality for the investors to show unified family support. My assistant will email it over. He squeezed my fingers patronizingly. I know legal jargon bores you, so do not worry about reading through all the boilerplate text. Just sign the last page, and I will have it couriered back to the office. I looked directly into his eyes. He was banking on my supposed ignorance, relying on the narrative he had constructed, where I was just a supportive wife who handled low-level administrative tasks. He truly believed I would blindly hand over the keys to my ancestral legacy without a second thought. Of course, Harrison, I said, my tone analytical and completely detached. Send it over first thing tomorrow. I will make sure it is fully executed exactly the way it needs to be. You are the best, he murmured, kissing my cheek. The dinner proceeded through dessert and espresso. There were no arguments, no raised voices, and no broken plates. We played our parts flawlessly. But as I watched Harrison order the check, I was already calculating the forensic audit I would launch at dawn. The trap was set, and the predator was officially circling its prey. I arrived at my office at 6 the next morning. My firm occupies the top 2 floors of a glass monolith in Midtown Manhattan. The aesthetic is strictly minimalist. Clean lines, brushed steel, and biometric security at every entrance. It is a space designed for clarity and absolute control. I bypassed my usual morning espresso and walked straight into the main conference room where Marcus Pierce was already waiting. My brother-in-law looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression grave but focused. Sitting next to him was David, my lead forensic accountant, a man who could find a missing dollar in a maze of international shell companies. "Good morning, Victoria," Marcus said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded courtrooms, but right now it held the quiet solidarity of family. He pushed a thick leather-bound portfolio across the polished mahogany table. "We have been running the numbers since your message last night. The quitclaim deed was just the surface. What we found beneath it is a systemic financial hemorrhage." I opened the folder. The first page displayed a complex flowchart of corporate wire transfers. David adjusted his glasses and pointed to a series of red lines funneling away from Harrison's primary commercial real estate accounts. "Your husband is not just leveraging your personal assets, Victoria." David explained, his tone entirely clinical. "He has been actively embezzling from his own Series A investors for the past 14 months. He set up an offshore shell corporation registered as a luxury property management firm. The sole managing director of that LLC is Jessica." I stared at the name printed in stark black ink on the financial summary. Jessica, the 27-year-old vice president who was currently wearing my Cartier gold. "Where exactly is the stolen money going?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. Marcus tapped a secondary document. "A multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse in Tribeca, purchased entirely in cash through the shell company. He is draining his corporate operating accounts to fund a secret life with his mistress while using your ancestral Hamptons estate to cover the massive deficits he has created on his company balance sheets." I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over my mind. Harrison was not merely a cheating husband. He was a corporate parasite, destroying everything he touched to maintain an illusion of grandeur. But the true scale of his hubris was yet to be revealed. "There is one more thing," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. A faint, razor-thin smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Harrison submitted his desperate Series B funding application late last night. He is seeking $40 million to keep his sinking ship afloat. Do you know which private equity firm he applied to?" I looked at the cover sheet of the loan application and felt a genuine laugh rise in my chest. It was a cold, calculated sound. "Apex Capital," I read aloud. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. Apex Capital was one of the most aggressive venture capital firms on the eastern seaboard. They were known for executing hostile takeovers of failing commercial real estate portfolios. What Harrison absolutely did not know, because he had never bothered to learn anything about my family beyond our address, was that Apex Capital was a wholly owned subsidiary of the DuPont Family Blind Trust. My father, Thomas, the man Harrison had openly mocked over a $3,000 bottle of vintage Bordeaux the night before, was the chairman of the board. Harrison was unknowingly begging his own father-in-law for a bailout to save his fraudulent empire. "We are not going to block the loan application," I told Marcus, my mind already constructing the architecture of Harrison's public execution. "We are going to weaponize it." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his elite legal mind instantly catching up. "You want to approve the funding round?" "Tentatively," I corrected. "I want you to draft a term sheet from Apex Capital indicating full approval of the $40 million. However, you are going to embed a highly specific covenant clause deep within the boilerplate text. The clause must stipulate an unconditional surrender of all corporate equity and personal assets in the event of documented fiduciary breach, fraud, or embezzlement. Make the legal language dense and impenetrable. Harrison is so desperate for this cash injection and so unbelievably arrogant that he will never have his outside counsel properly review a standard approval form. He will sign it." "It is a financial guillotine," Marcus said. "I will have the drafted terms on your desk by noon." The trap was mathematically perfect. By signing the agreement, Harrison would legally hand over his entire company to my family the precise moment we exposed his embezzlement. I spent the afternoon executing my own defensive maneuvers. I summoned my wealth management team and quietly transferred all my personal liquid assets, my diversified investment portfolios, and the deed to the Hamptons estate into a highly fortified, revocable living trust. I locked away my legacy behind impenetrable legal walls, completely severing any financial access Harrison thought he possessed. When I returned to our Upper East Side apartment that evening, Harrison was waiting in the expansive living room pouring himself a generous glass of scotch. The tentative approval from Apex Capital had arrived in his inbox 2 hours prior, and he was practically vibrating with unearned triumph. He looked at me completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor I had just finished building. "Good news at the office today?" I asked, slipping off my coat and maintaining my carefully constructed facade of the supportive, oblivious wife. "Better than good," Harrison boasted, taking a heavy sip of his drink. "Apex Capital is moving forward with the Series B funding. $40 million, Victoria. I told you my vision for the commercial real estate market on the eastern seaboard was unstoppable. The big leagues have finally recognized my brilliance." He walked over and looked down at me, his demeanor shifting from celebratory to condescending. "Now that my firm is moving into this elite echelon, we need to talk about your role," he said, his tone adopting the patronizing edge of a disappointed parent. "You have been playing around with these low-level financial portfolios for years, Victoria. It is cute, but it is distracting. I need a wife who is fully present. You need to step back from your little job and focus entirely on supporting me." I kept my breathing perfectly steady, analyzing the sheer audacity of the man standing in front of me. He was demanding I quit the very career that secretly funded his lavish lifestyle, while actively planning to abandon me for a 27-year-old mistress in a Tribeca penthouse bought with stolen investor money. "You want me to resign?" I asked, my voice perfectly neutral. "It is for the best," Harrison insisted, stepping closer to invade my personal space. "And while we are making these necessary adjustments, we need to discuss your parents. I was happy to humor them at dinner last night, but their allowance is becoming a massive drain on our accounts. I am cutting off the monthly stipends we send them." My blood ran absolute zero. The monthly stipends he was referring to were actually dividends from a minor trust my father had set up for him as a wedding gift. Harrison genuinely believed he was the primary breadwinner, generously keeping my poor elderly parents afloat. "I see," I replied, offering him a soft, compliant smile. "If you truly believe cutting them off is the best financial strategy for your company, Harrison, then that is exactly what we will do." "I'm glad you finally understand," he said, patting my shoulder. "Just make sure you sign that spousal consent form when my assistant sends it over. We finalize everything at the gala on Friday." He turned and walked toward his private study, leaving me alone in the grand foyer. I watched his retreating back, feeling the cold, heavy weight of absolute certainty. He thought he had successfully forced me into submission while securing his fraudulent empire. He had absolutely no idea that I had just finished digging his grave, and on Friday night, in front of everyone he knew, I was going to push him in. The evening of the Series B signing gala arrived with the kind of manufactured grandeur that defined Harrison and his entire business philosophy. He had transformed the top floor of his commercial real estate headquarters into a glittering showcase of corporate hubris. Waiters navigated through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. The room was packed with venture capitalists, socialites, and financial journalists, all eager to witness what they believed was the crowning achievement of a rising industry titan. I arrived wearing a tailored emerald green gown that my mother had purchased for me in Paris, perfectly playing the role of the devoted and quietly supportive wife. Harrison was in his element, holding court near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. He looked incredibly arrogant in his custom tuxedo, projecting an image of absolute dominance. Standing right beside him, functioning as his unofficial co-host, was Jessica. The 27-year-old vice president of acquisitions was draped in a silver dress that left very little to the imagination, and my Cartier love bracelet was still prominently displayed on her wrist. Harrison parading her around in front of our investors and colleagues was a calculated insult. He was testing my compliance, completely convinced that I was too naive and too dependent to challenge him in a public forum. I watched him introduce her to a group of influential developers, referring to her as his brilliant right hand and the driving force behind their recent acquisitions. He was essentially giving her credit for the very deals that were secretly bankrupting his company. After an hour of watching this charade, Harrison caught my eye across the room. He gave Jessica a pat on the lower back, a gesture that was entirely too intimate for a professional setting, before excusing himself and walking toward me. His smile was wide and practiced for the cameras flashing around the room, but his eyes were cold and impatient. He gripped my elbow with a force that bordered on bruising and steered me away from the main gala floor. We walked down a sleek corridor and entered his primary boardroom. The space was enclosed in thick, soundproof glass, meaning the 200 guests outside could see us perfectly but could not hear a single word. It was a theatrical choice, designed to make our interaction look like a private moment of spousal celebration. As soon as the heavy glass door clicked shut, the charismatic smile vanished from his face completely. The facade dropped, revealing the desperate and predatory man hiding underneath. He walked over to the mahogany table and picked up a sleek leather folio. He opened it to reveal the routine spousal consent form he had mentioned at dinner. He slid it across the polished wood toward me, tapping the signature line. I looked down at the document and then back up at him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. When I did not immediately reach for the pen, Harrison leaned in close. His voice dropped to a harsh, menacing whisper that contrasted sharply with the supportive husband image he was broadcasting to the audience outside the glass. He told me that my days of playing around with low-level financial portfolios were over. He explicitly stated that if I did not sign the consent form right now and hand over the rights to my ancestral assets, he would file for divorce the following morning. He threatened to drag my name through the mud, claiming he would easily convince a judge that I was emotionally unfit, completely financially dependent on him, and mentally unstable. He promised to take the Hamptons estate, the property my grandmother had left exclusively to me, and liquidate it to fund his company. He thought he had me completely trapped inside that glass box, surrounded by his supposed victory. He genuinely believed that the threat of public humiliation and financial ruin would force me into immediate submission. He was expecting tears or panic or at the very least a desperate negotiation. He stood there looming right over me, intoxicated by his own perceived power, completely blind to the reality of the situation. I did not cry and I did not panic. I maintained eye contact with the man who was actively attempting to destroy my life and let a slow, analytical smile form on my lips. I reached into my clutch and retrieved my Mont Blanc fountain pen. The heavy gold barrel felt cool against my fingers, a physical reminder of the actual power dynamics at play in this room. I uncapped the pen with deliberate precision, projecting an aura of complete surrender that Harrison was entirely too eager to accept. I looked down at his spousal consent form, the document supposed to legally bind my generational wealth to his fraudulent enterprise. I did not sign it. Instead, I smoothly slid my hand into the hidden compartment of my oversized designer clutch. That morning, my brother-in-law, Marcus Pierce, had couriered a highly specific legal binder directly to my high-security office. The binder was bound in the same premium black leather as the folio Harrison was currently using. It was a flawless visual match, designed to pass unnoticed in a moment of high adrenaline. In one fluid, practiced motion, I swapped his document pad with the legal binder Marcus had prepared. The thick, soundproof glass of the boardroom worked perfectly to my advantage. To the hundreds of guests observing us from the gala floor, it simply looked like a wife proudly reviewing and signing a celebratory business document for her successful husband. I pressed the Mont Blanc pen against the premium paper of the substituted binder and signed my name with absolute authority on the designated witness line. The document I was signing was not a consent form granting him access to my assets. It was the heavily modified term sheet from Apex Capital, the venture capital firm wholly owned by my father. Hidden deep within the boilerplate text of this specific binder was the financial guillotine Marcus and I had carefully constructed. It was the unconditional surrender of equity clause triggered instantly by any documented evidence of fiduciary breach or corporate embezzlement. I finished my signature and capped the pen. I closed the leather folio and handed it back to Harrison. His eyes were wide with greedy anticipation. He snatched the binder from my hands, completely oblivious to the slight difference in the weight of the paper and the density of the legal text. He was operating on pure arrogance and the desperate adrenaline of a man who believed he had just narrowly escaped absolute ruin. He was so incredibly eager to return to the gala floor to address the financial press and to publicly claim his massive $40 million victory that all basic business protocols completely vanished from his mind. He did not bother to review the clauses. He did not call his general counsel to verify the final execution pages. He simply flipped to the back of the binder, saw my neat signature on the left side of the page, and hastily scrawled his own name on the primary counterparty execution line. He pressed down so hard the ink bled slightly into the paper. The moment his signature was complete, the trap snapped shut with devastating legal finality. He had just unconditionally signed away his entire commercial real estate empire to the very family he had relentlessly mocked at a five-star restaurant just days prior. Harrison closed the folio and let out a long breath of pure relief. He adjusted his silk tie and flashed me a patronizing smile, completely unaware that he had just signed his own corporate death warrant. He told me that I had finally made a smart decision and that perhaps there was hope for our marriage after all if I continued to learn my place. He instructed me to wait in the boardroom for a few minutes so he could make his grand entrance and deliver his keynote address to the media alone. I nodded graciously, playing the role of the submissive wife one final time. I watched through the soundproof glass as he confidently strode back out onto the glittering gala floor, heading straight for the podium where the microphones were waiting. Jessica immediately drifted to his side, beaming with the misplaced pride of a mistress who thought she had secured a billionaire. I stood alone in the quiet glass room, looking out at the crowd of investors who were about to witness the most spectacular corporate execution in modern history. My phone vibrated in my clutch. It was a single text message from Marcus, confirming that the forensic audit files and the wire fraud evidence had just been formally submitted to the federal authorities. I smoothed my emerald gown and walked toward the doors, stepping out into the lights to watch my husband proudly announce his own absolute destruction. Harrison stepped up to the acrylic podium at the center of the ballroom, and the low hum of conversation instantly died down. The bright lights illuminated his custom tuxedo as he adjusted the microphone with practiced ease. He looked out over the sea of investors and socialites with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just conquered Manhattan. He proudly held up his hand to silence the polite applause and began his highly anticipated keynote address. His voice echoed through the massive room, dripping with unearned confidence, as he officially announced the $40 million capital injection from Apex Capital. He called it a historic moment for commercial real estate on the Eastern Seaboard, claiming his visionary leadership had single-handedly secured the future of the firm. Then he turned his attention to the front row, where his 27-year-old vice president Jessica was sitting. He extended his hand toward her and publicly praised her brilliant acquisition strategies and relentless drive, attributing a significant portion of the success of the company directly to her efforts. The entire room blindly clapped for the mistress wearing my stolen Cartier jewelry. Finally, almost as an afterthought, Harrison glanced over at me, standing quietly near the stage in my emerald green gown. He offered a condescending smile and thanked his wife for her quiet support and for keeping things running smoothly at home while he handled the heavy lifting of corporate empire building. The sheer audacity of his speech was magnificent. He was claiming victory on a stage built entirely on my stolen assets. But just as the final round of applause began to swell, the heavy oak doors of the private VIP lounge swung open with a resounding thud. The applause faltered and died completely as Thomas DuPont stepped into the ballroom. My father did not look anything like the retired regional logistics manager Harrison foolishly believed him to be. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, radiating the quiet, terrifying authority of generational wealth. Flanking him on either side were three elite corporate litigators carrying thick leather briefcases. They bypassed the velvet ropes and walked straight down the center aisle toward the stage. Harrison gripped the sides of the podium, looking genuinely bewildered. He let out a nervous chuckle and leaned into the microphone. He politely asked the security guard stationed near the front to please assist his confused father-in-law and escort him back to the family seating area before he embarrassed himself. The security guards took one look at the formidable elite legal team surrounding my father and wisely decided not to move a single muscle to intervene. I walked calmly up the steps of the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. I approached Harrison and smoothly slid the microphone directly out of his hand. He looked at me with a sharp mixture of annoyance and confusion, but I did not offer him a reassuring smile. My face was a mask of absolute analytical detachment. I looked out at the 200 guests, the flashing cameras, and the deeply confused board of directors seated in the front row. I spoke with a voice completely stripped of emotion, ringing clear and cold across the silent ballroom. I told the audience that there had been a slight misunderstanding regarding the power dynamics of this evening. I introduced the man standing at the base of the stage, not as a confused retiree, but as Thomas DuPont, the chairman of the DuPont Trust. I watched the faces of the venture capitalists and board members completely transform as they recognized the name. I explained in precise, undeniable legal terminology that the multi-billion-dollar DuPont Trust was the sole controlling owner of Apex Capital, the very private equity firm Harrison was currently celebrating as his ultimate salvation. The color instantly drained from the face of Harrison as the reality of my words hit him. He looked from me to my father and back again, his jaw slightly slack, as his brain struggled to process the massive systemic failure of his entire worldview. Before Harrison could even attempt to formulate a coherent response or demand an explanation, I opened the heavy premium black leather binder he had signed just 10 minutes prior in the glass conference room. I held up the document for the entire room to see and read the specific covenant clause aloud. I explained that what Harrison had signed was not a standard funding agreement or a celebratory term sheet. I read the legal text word for word, stating that the principal signatory agreed to an unconditional surrender of all corporate equity and personal assets in the event of documented fiduciary breach and corporate embezzlement. Harrison stammered, stepping forward and trying to grab the binder from my hands, but my father and his lead attorneys immediately blocked his path. Harrison shouted into the silent room that the contract was completely invalid and that he had committed no such breaches of fiduciary duty. Right on cue, Marcus Pierce strode confidently onto the stage. My brother-in-law did not even look at Harrison. He walked directly past him and approached Jessica, who was now trembling visibly in the front row. Marcus reached into his tailored jacket and handed her a thick-sealed legal envelope. He announced loudly enough for the microphones to catch every single syllable that she was being formally served with a federal subpoena for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. Jessica let out a choked, terrified sob and dropped her crystal champagne glass, allowing it to shatter loudly and dramatically across the polished marble floor. I turned my focused attention directly to the seated board of directors, who were staring at the unfolding scene in absolute horror. I verbally laid out the meticulous forensic financial trail my lead accountants had compiled over the past 24 hours, expertly analyzing every hidden bank account and fraudulent wire transfer. I detailed the exact millions of investor funds that had been illegally funneled through the offshore shell company registered in the name of Jessica. I provided the exact address of the luxury Tribeca penthouse Harrison had purchased in cash with their stolen operating capital. To remove any remaining doubt, my legal team handed copies of the forensic audit directly to the seated board members. The room was deathly silent. The only sound was the rapid clicking of camera shutters as the financial journalists captured the total public annihilation of a supposedly brilliant chief executive officer. The chairman of the board, a ruthless man who did not tolerate financial vulnerability of any kind, stood up from his front row seat. He looked at Harrison with absolute, unfiltered disgust and called for an immediate emergency verbal vote of the corporate directors present. Within 30 seconds, the board unanimously voted to approve a hostile corporate takeover by Apex Capital and formally terminated Harrison from his leadership position effectively immediately without severance. Harrison stood frozen on the brightly lit stage, his face completely ashen and his hands shaking uncontrollably. His custom suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his rapidly collapsing frame. He looked out at the massive sea of elite investors and former colleagues staring back at him with a mixture of harsh professional judgment and pathetic social pity. In under 3 minutes, the commercial real estate empire he thought he had secured through manipulation and deceit was legally and permanently absorbed by the family he had consistently belittled. I handed the executed unconditional surrender document to Marcus and stepped away from the acrylic podium, leaving Harrison standing completely alone in the wreckage of his own monumental arrogance. The gala immediately dissolved into absolute chaos. The remaining board members scrambled toward the exits, frantically dialing their own crisis management teams, while the financial press swarmed the stage like sharks scenting blood in the water. Harrison stumbled down the acrylic steps, his breathing erratic and his eyes wide with the sudden devastating realization of his new reality. He pushed past a bewildered socialite and desperately tried to approach me, his hands reaching out as he stammered a pathetic stream of apologies and frantic promises to fix absolutely everything. He never made it within 10 feet of me. Marcus stepped smoothly into his path, blocking him with the effortless physical authority of a man who spent his life dismantling corporate criminals in federal courtrooms. Marcus adjusted his tailored jacket and spoke in a voice that carried perfectly over the escalating noise of the ruined ballroom. He explicitly informed Harrison that stepping 1 inch closer would constitute a direct violation of the immediate restraining order filed that morning to protect the physical and financial assets of the DuPont estate. He advised Harrison to save his apologies for his defense attorney because he was going to need a very expensive one. I did not even look at my soon-to-be ex-husband as I turned to leave. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a fleeting glimpse of Jessica. The 27-year-old vice president was shoving her way through the heavy brass doors at the back of the venue, fleeing the gala in hysterical tears, with her silver dress snagging on the velvet ropes. She was leaving behind the shattered illusion of her billionaire lifestyle and running directly toward a federal indictment for wire fraud. I walked out into the Manhattan night completely untouched by the wreckage. 6 months later, the harsh and bitter winter air had given way to a warm coastal breeze sweeping across the private stone terrace of my Hamptons estate. I was hosting an elegant, intimate dinner party to celebrate the close of a highly profitable financial quarter. The dining table was set with pristine white linen and glowing taper candles illuminating the faces of the people who actually mattered. My father Thomas sat at the head of the table laughing deeply at a story being told by Marcus. My mother Catherine was pouring wine for my loyal sister-in-law, her heavy diamond tennis bracelet catching the ambient light. It was a picture of absolute serenity and unbreakable familial loyalty. During the exquisite main course, Marcus leaned over and quietly provided me with an update on the ongoing legal proceedings happening back in the city. The wheels of the American justice system turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Harrison was currently facing a sweeping federal indictment for his extensive embezzlement and wire fraud. His commercial real estate firm had been completely liquidated by Apex Capital to compensate the defrauded investors. Without access to corporate funds or my ancestral wealth to continuously bail him out, his luxurious lifestyle had rapidly evaporated. According to the court filings, the man who had once mocked my parents at a five-star restaurant was now living in a tiny, cramped, rented studio apartment in a remarkably undesirable neighborhood, desperately relying on a severely overworked public defender to keep him out of federal prison. Jessica had immediately turned state's evidence against him to save herself, proving that loyalty bought with stolen Cartier jewelry is entirely worthless. I looked out over the meticulously manicured gardens, listening to the harmonious sounds of my family enjoying their evening together. I reached for my crystal glass, filled with an actual $3,000 vintage Bordeaux, carefully selected from my private underground cellar. I raised the wine to the beautiful summer sky, allowing myself a moment of quiet, profound pride. True titans do not ever need to raise their voices, demand attention, or boast arrogantly at fancy dinner tables. We understand that real enduring power operates in the absolute silence of strategy. We simply hold the executioner's pen, maintain our deadly calm, wait patiently for the entitled and arrogant to stumble into our traps, and then we effortlessly rewrite the entire narrative,